Hello everybody, welcome to Melbourne Traditionalists, episode 5. My name's David Hiscox, I'm here with Mark Moncrief. How are you?
I'm very good, thank you. How are you?
Very good. Mark has very kindly allowed me to host this episode because last week he interviewed me on my political development. This week I'll be interviewing him on his political development. But first of all, Mark, you were telling me that you saw a very interesting movie over the weekend.
I did. I saw Danger Close, which is about the Battle of Long Tan.
Good.
In 1966 in Vietnam.
How was it in terms of Australian movies? Because Australian movies are pretty awful.
Actually, I went in very apprehensive.
Yes.
And I would recommend the movie. I think it was quite good. I was very impressed with the equipment, the military equipment. It was all real. And I also liked the battle scenes. They were very good. There were some problems I had with the movie. Some of the characterizations were a bit weird. It's 1966 and people are using modern language instead of the language of the time. Mm-hmm. So I have a bit of a problem with the script.
Yeah. Yes, but you were saying they were using the F word a lot rather than the words that Aussies used to say.
That's right. Before the 1970s, the F word was not... It certainly existed, but it wasn't very common.
Yes.
And in fact, people use the phrase colourful language. Mm-hmm. And it was colourful.
Because they came up
with... the
F
word is not very colourful, it's just...
Because they came up with imaginative ways to not say the F word.
Exactly right, yes. Yeah. So unfortunately that was missing, and that was a real opportunity missed. But actually it told an interesting story, quite amazing story. 106 Australians, 2 New Zealanders, facing 2,000 plus communist troops and fighting them off. And an interesting thing is that we don't, even today, 50 years later, we don't know why the communists were there. We have suspicions about why they were there, but we don't actually know. Because the communists claimed they won the battle, but they obviously didn't win the battle because they don't talk about it.
Yes. Well, and our communist establishment, i.e. academia and the media, like to avoid talking about battles and wars post-World War II because it wasn't against the Nazis. It was against the communists. They don't like to talk about that.
Yeah. Although there are places like the Australian War Memorial which are very happy to talk about that. Yes. Ironically, during the Vietnam War, they ignored it. Yes. And it wasn't until decades later that they actually said, hey, we should actually be representing these wars as well. Korea, Malaya, Vietnam, Borneo. So, for example, their display on Malaya in the 1950s is quite sparse because a lot of that material didn't survive.
Yes.
Even though the Australian War Memorial existed at that time and could have easily gotten the material in the 1950s when it was common.
Wow. I know that the establishment don't like to talk about Malaya because that was a jungle war that the West actually won.
That's exactly right. A guerrilla war that we won.
Yes.
Yeah, it took 12 years and, it got pretty bad there at one stage. The British governor was actually assassinated in an ambush.
Wow.
So, things are pretty bad when the governor is being killed.
Yes.
But long campaign, but we won.
Yes. Because the Vietnam War actually followed a similar line. The left establishment liked to paint the Vietnam War as a war that we were never going to win.
That's right.
But the truth is, we actually won the war in terms of the fighting. Once the Americans bombed Hanoi, the North Vietnamese sued for peace. And so a line was established which essentially returned the divisions between North and South Vietnam to what they were before the war. So we had saved South Vietnam. But then it was the Democrat-controlled Armed Services Committee, which a couple of years later took away all funding and support for the South Vietnamese government. Once they did that, that's when the North Vietnamese came in and just walked in.
I will say yes and no to what you have said. Basically, militarily, the Vietnam War is 2 wars.
Yes.
There's the internal war fought by the Viet Cong and other dissident groups against the Saigon government, South Vietnamese government, and then you have the invasion from North Vietnam.
Yes.
Right? So they merge. The Viet Cong were defeated by about 1969.
Yes. Okay.
Because during the Tet Offensive in 1968 and Little Tet, which was later on that same year, the Viet Cong were actually used not as guerrilla troops but as shock troops to try and overrun American bases, South Vietnamese bases, and in conventional warfare we were just much better.
Yes.
So we completely destroyed those units.
So
when those units were rebuilt,
yes,
they were actually rebuilt with North Vietnamese. So they were still called 9th VC Regiment, but it was actually filled with Northerners, not Southerners.
Right.
In 1973, when the Paris Peace Accord was signed, the North Vietnamese were actually allowed to stay in South Vietnam.
Wow.
So there were hundreds of thousands of North Vietnamese troops in the south.
Right.
And America just wanted to get out. And its bombing campaign, Linebacker 2, which was a very successful campaign, completely destroyed North Vietnam's air defences, the second most comprehensive air defence system in the world at that time. The only other target that was more heavily defended was Moscow. So it smashed their air force, smashed the surface-to-air missiles, and North Vietnam was basically forced to sign this agreement.
Yes.
And the agreement was that the Americans would leave. That's the real agreement. And in private, President Nixon said, well, I'll be able to re-intervene at any time. But the Congress had not agreed to that. And the Congress didn't have any mechanism to reintroduce American combat forces, air, sea, land, under any conditions. And what happened was, partly because of the war, is the Congress actually moved to the left. So then what happened is what you were saying, is that the Congress began to cut off money to South Vietnam. And of course the communists, China, the Soviet Union, they didn't stop supporting North Vietnam.
No, they never stopped.
That's right, they never stopped. They kept building up, they kept sending them the money, food, weapons of course. And then when the crunch came, South Vietnam fell, and the Americans did not lift a finger to help them.
Right. Thank you for expanding on that, Mark. That's tremendous. That's opened up a whole new avenue of research for me as well. It's nice to have all that fleshed out. Yeah. It's been a very interesting week as well. Just over the weekend, we've had the suiciding of Jeffrey Epstein. The internet has exploded.
How bizarre.
What's tremendous is that nobody, either on the left or the right, believes the mainstream media narrative of this.
It's so improbable, isn't it?
Yes.
I mean, here's a man who there are all these rumours and theories about, and I'm not sure what to quite make of all of them, but he's in custody. He's obviously done some nasty things to people, and he tried to commit suicide, 2 weeks ago?
Yes. Apparently he tried, yes.
And that was big news.
Yes.
And then 2 weeks later, he not only attempts, he succeeds.
Yes.
I mean, how is that possible?
It's not. He was in a cell which is entirely glass walls.
You know, the modern cells are not like the ones you see on TV. No. They're very, very Spartan, very harsh. There's no... You can't hang things off. You know, there are concrete beds.
Yes, the kind of cell I'm imagining is the cell that they put Magneto in X-Men.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's so stupid. It's ridiculous. And so there are the photos comparing the nose and ears and facial profile of the possible body double that they wheeled out.
From the attempt.
Yeah, and they still had a bag there supposedly to keep him alive, even though he was found dead in his cell, reportedly.
Yeah. So
the internet's exploding over that, like whether he committed suicide, whether he was killed, whether he's been whisked out of the country. It's amazing. But yeah, for me, the great thing about this is, apart from the fact that a pedophile is dead, is that nobody believes the mainstream media narrative on this. People are just saying, no, this is stupid, why are you lying? On both the left and the right. And blue tick people on Twitter are doubting the mainstream media narrative.
Well, I mean, it's just astonishing that this can even be a story.
Yeah.
You know, yeah. I mean, as I said, the man tried to commit suicide. You'd think that he was being watched, that, you know, precautions were being taken. How is it possible?
Yeah.
I saw a joke yesterday saying, if you're shocked about Epstein suiciding, imagine how he feels.
Yes. He would have seen it coming just like the rest of us, mind you.
Well, yeah, you do wonder, you know. I mean, it seems more likely that somebody killed him than he killed himself.
Yes.
You know, considering he's in a cell where he basically can't do anything.
Yeah, yeah. And from there, the red pill is people say, okay, well, what was he actually doing? Why did he do that? Was he just doing this because he's a pedophile? It seems that he has all these connections to high-profile people. Why was he providing sex slaves to high-profile people? Who was getting him to do this in the first place? It just opens up that whole can of worms, and it brings that into the public consciousness.
Well, Steve Saylor did a review of the movie Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, which has just come out, and he asked the question, how was it that Charles Manson, who was a druggie, he'd been in prison, he was a nobody, how did he get invited to all these Hollywood parties? How was he known by all these Hollywood people? And he said, well, the answer is because he had jailbait. He had underage girls that he could supply. Right? So he was a pimp.
Yes.
And that's what it seems to be the case with Epstein.
Yes.
That he was a pimp, but he was a high-class pimp. But the real question is, how did he get into that market?
Yes.
How did he get into that class of people?
Where did he get the money?
Where did he get the money? There's the big question.
Yeah.
You know, it's not his sexual abuse, it's where does the money come from? Yeah,
yeah. And yeah, that's why this story is amazing. It's not surprising why they've done away with him, but it's the can of worms. Jeffrey Epstein is that can of worms.
Yeah. I was reading an article about where his money came from, because he said that he was an investment banker and he invested money and he had very high profile clients, and they were, you know, if you were you had to be a billionaire to invest with him.
Wow.
Right?
Yes.
But people who work in that industry, they asked, hey, have you dealt with Epstein? And it turned out that nobody has dealt with him.
Yes.
So how is it possible that he could be generating this money if he's not involved in the industry?
Maybe from another state, a foreign state, something like that. I don't know.
Well, I think that there is some intelligence connection there, you know, and it sounds very much, well, again, in another article I read was about a journalist arriving at Epstein's mansion, in New York. So this is 15 years ago, roughly, and he had a butler, and the butler asked him when he came in, "Oh, would you like a massage, sir, from a young girl?"
Yeah.
And he said, "No, I don't."
Yeah.
And he said straight away it smelled like honey trap.
Yes.
You know, where people are given the opportunity to have sex with people they shouldn't, and then it's photographed.
Yes.
And, you know, and people are blackmailed.
And we wonder why politicians come in to campaign saying they're going to do one thing, and then when they get into power they say another. You can see the fear in their eyes, I think.
I think in some cases that's true. Although the Z-Man or Z-Man, I guess as the Americans say it.
Yes.
He had an article that was very interesting. He went to the National Conservative Convention in Washington, D.C. About a month ago, and he was saying that, you know, the people there were actually quite pleasant and nice, and so he's meeting all these people that he wouldn't normally associate with and wouldn't normally want to associate with. And he said that, you know, you could see how you could be seduced into that and accept ideas that back home you wouldn't accept.
That can be an interesting segue into the main topic today, because I find whenever I meet people in the Liberal base, a lot of them seem like me, quite conservative.
Yeah.
They seem to have a certain idea of what they want for the country, and then we see what the Liberal Party actually put through, and it's completely different. I was talking about my own journey away from the Liberal Party last week. It seems that you started that journey quite a lot earlier than I did.
Yes. I grew up in the electorate of Scullin, which is in the northern suburbs of Melbourne. Mm-hmm. And when I was growing up, it was the strongest Labor seat in the country.
Yes.
But I never really liked the Labor Party either. But I was reading the newspaper. I was 14, 15, 16, and there was just a little tiny paragraph in the paper, and it was about the State Liberal Conference, and the members of the Liberal Party had voted, so this is the mid-1980s, had voted to reintroduce capital punishment. And not a single member of Parliament would actually take their vote and make it an issue. And I thought to myself, if the parliamentary members of the Liberal Party aren't prepared to take the opinion of ordinary members of the Liberal Party, well, what hope does any of us have?
Yes. I think something similar to that happened recently when there was a Liberal Party conference, and it was either to do with immigration or gay marriage, I think, where they passed a motion at the Liberal Party conference, and it was very quickly quashed by the Liberal Party. It's something I should know. Well, I'll have to duck go it.
Well, we think of Scott Morrison as being the leader of the Liberal Party.
Yes.
And Albanese as being the leader of the Labor Party. But actually, both the Liberal and Labor Party have presidents. And they're the people who actually run the parties.
Right.
And they're the ones who get to decide who gets to be a member of Parliament and a senator and, all these kinds of things. And policy, because all those policies are actually made in secret. They're not made in public. Mm-hmm. And it's amazing that these secret things can go on, and our media just doesn't talk about them at all.
So going back to you were saying, you read that article in your formative years. Where did that take you from there? What kind of politics did you support?
The area where I grew up in was, even when I was growing up, very multicultural. So back then it was Australians, Italians, Greeks, Yugoslavs, Turks. Mm-hmm. So I grew up as a minority in my area. Now, in the 70s, that wasn't very common for an Australian to grow up as a minority. But what I found out is that while there's a lot of wonderful people who are Greeks and Italians and so forth, they're not my people.
Yes. And
that, I've never been able to shake that. And even Italian's not my person. Well, what hope does a Vietnamese or an Ethiopian I mean, they may be wonderful people.
Yep.
They might be very intelligent. They might be, fabulously good looking. They might be, just the most delightful person, but they're not my type of person because they're not me. And that doesn't go away when they get an accent that sounds like mine.
Mm-hmm. You're making some really, really good points, and we're coming up against, I guess, one of the fault lines in the nationalist movement. Do we see ourselves as pan-European? Yep. Do we see ourselves as parochially British or Australian? It's an important distinction to make, because it's something that being friends and working with people from Southern Europe and South America has been something that really opened my eyes to that cultural difference. And that racial difference too. Because these people, yes, they speak with an Australian accent, they barrack for AFL teams, they have sausages and fish and chips, but
it's meat pie and football.
Meat pie and football nationalism.
Yeah.
But they're always they see their family all the time.
Yeah.
And they have community events all the time. It's something that unless you know these people personally, you don't always get to see. You don't really appreciate how much of their life is spent at community events, preparing for community events.
Yeah.
And these community events, they celebrate their culture all the time, and they tell their stories all the time.
Yeah.
The stories of their own people all the time.
Yeah.
And then they turn around and they say, "Oh well, I know this is a very long question here, but anyway."
It's actually.
They turn around and they say, "Oh, you Aussies, you don't have the same kind of family culture as we do."
Yeah.
And they'll even say, "Oh, you know, like it's the Aussies, it's the Anglos who are more likely to be lefties and all this sort of stuff." I see that and I'm like, well, we used to be this like you, but we've had this brainwashing for much longer than you have.
Well, it's true, and I think that you know, people on our side are often called white supremacists and so forth. And actually, I think in when it comes to family and community, I think that many of these ethnic groups are way above us. They're superior to us. That, and as you point out, that wasn't always the case. In fact, when I was at school, I had an American teacher, and she said, "You know, I'm amazed about you Australians because you know you'll go visit your family on a Sunday just because you don't have anything else to do." And she said, "In America, we never do that."
Yeah, right. And so you were told this back in the 70s or the 80s?
Yeah, so late 80s.
So that was an American pointing out that Aussies had a more family-orientated culture back in the 80s.
Yeah, exactly.
And look at Australian culture now.
Exactly, yeah. And in fact, in the 80s, you could actually see it starting to break up.
Yeah. It's something that I don't bring up that often because, you know, I'm good friends with these people. But it's when I'm told this, I feel like saying to them, look, in another 20 or 30 years' time, Italians and Greeks, even Turks, you're going to be in the same boat. You're going to have another generation's worth of brainwashing.
There's one of the things that, you know, liberalism smashes families. It creates individuals. And in time, and that's all it is, just time, they will be as individualistic as us.
Yes.
And in fact, you see that very starkly with Chinese families. The family comes here and they're very family focused and they're quite based.
Yes.
And then their children are SJWs. And they're far to the left. And sure, they still go to the family functions, but it's because mum and dad insist. It's not because they insist. And that's pretty sad to see. And that's another reason why I'm against immigration. It's not just because of how it affects us, but how it affects them.
Yes. It
destroys them.
Yes. It's a terrible thing to say. I've made this case that if you believe in civic nationalism, you can believe that everybody should integrate into the dominant culture of Australia because we're an Australian country and you come here for Australian values and Australian culture, fish and chips and AFL.
Yeah.
You're saying to these people, you must leave your culture and no longer identify as the thing that you genetically are. It's a horrible thing to say to somebody.
Yeah. And now they say, well, you know, we've got multiculturalism, so people don't have to do that. They can come here and they can still maintain their culture and traditions. But how does that affect us?
And multiculturalism is essentially ethnic nationalism in lots of different pockets.
I guess you could argue that. Although I would say that multiculturalism is purposely misnamed because it's really multiracialism.
Yes.
And it's so controversial that they can't even say it.
Yeah. So that's another interesting tangent again. So you're basically saying that like your upbringing in Melbourne's north gave you, it basically red-pilled you on race.
Yeah. To an extent. Yeah. But I think in my 20s I sort of retreated from that a bit because you're trying to fit in.
Yes.
You're trying to work out, hey, where do I fit in? How do I make sense of things? But I never lost that opposition to immigration and to multiculturalism. But I don't think I was quite red-pilled. I think I had accepted a lot of the civic nationalist ideas, you know. And I think because I hadn't really thought about them. And this is one of the things, is that there's so many things to think about in life that often we leave our thinking to other people. And we don't even realise it. And only when we actually start thinking about things, and thinking hurts, thinking physically hurts, and that's why a lot of people don't want to do it. It's not because they're stupid, it's because it's terribly uncomfortable, and you come to conclusions that can be quite devastating. But I think that, you know, over time I did come to see that a lot of the arguments that were put forward weren't really arguments. They were, you'd have to be an idiot to believe that. And it was social pressure.
Yes. Not
an intellectual argument, which is what the left always said that they engage in. You know, it's intellectual. They're so much smarter than everybody else, and it's just blatantly not true. And so they put this pressure on people, and people say, well, maybe the Ethiopian is as smart as me. Maybe he is as capable as me. Maybe he is, maybe, but you're not even allowed to question that. And that made me question it. Why aren't I allowed to question it? Why do I have to accept what you say, even when I know that it's not true? So, I get it. So now I am a race realist, but I think that it was a bit of a dip there.
Yes. Well, like you say, it hurts. Both the physical action of thinking hurts, like the brain is a muscle, and you're using parts of your brain once you start going there that you have not used before.
Yeah.
And then acting on the conclusions is hurtful because it changes your life.
Yeah, it does. Yeah. I've lost friends over this, over my political beliefs. And not just because they rejected me, but in some cases I rejected them. I'm like, no, I can't put up with your lies. So I have a friend who's just, I had a friend who was very much against John Howard. You know, he just hated John Howard. And it was so extreme that I defend John Howard.
Yeah, right. Was he hating John Howard for all the wrong reasons?
Well, he hated him because of his business decisions, and his big problem was executive salaries.
Okay.
And safety in the workplace and things like this. You know, so people could be hurt on the job, and companies could get away with it. Right. So he actually had a very bad experience with Telstra, and he wasn't physically hurt, but they basically destroyed his professional career.
Right.
And he tried to push it, and he didn't get anywhere. Right. He even spoke to members of the Labor Party, and they couldn't help him. The unions couldn't help him. Right. So he was very much, the businesses, they can just do what they want. They can just ride over people, you know. And in his case, it actually was true.
Yes.
So he focused that on John Howard.
Right.
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 And now I've forgotten what I was actually...
Well, I find it interesting that like he was so extreme that you were defending John Howard, because we spent a lot of time talking about how John Howard, like he stopped the boats but he opened the floodgates. It was a pretext. Yeah. So it was a bait and switch.
Yeah, exactly. So and it's very easy to fall into those my team, your team.
Yeah.
Debates. But getting back before, another friend of mine, he was his parents were immigrants and he was born here, and he contacted me earlier this year after we hadn't spoken for years, and he says, I sort of, I wasn't too nice to you, I stopped talking to you, which was strange to me because I'd stopped talking to him. And
it takes two to tango.
Well, yeah. And he said, but it was when you were all these, you became anti-immigration. It was just too much for me. And I thought to myself, this is the same old story.
Yeah.
His parents were immigrants, so he supports immigration.
Yep.
It never ends.
Yes, people don't always realise that they support certain policies because they have certain skin in the game. No pun intended there. Yeah. It's immigration is naturally going to change the nature of a country because you're bringing in people who have a different set of priorities and a different set of motivations. Yeah. I guess too. Maybe this will be the last question. Again, I feel like we've only just scratched the surface. But what got you out of the your team, my team kind of mindset?
I guess in that case, by not associating with that person, because I knew that I was defending something that I didn't really like.
Yes.
But yeah, I guess I realised that in the 80s there was an idea that went around that said that the Liberal and Labor Party were essentially the same party. And actually I heard that a lot, and then it just died, and people didn't say that anymore. But actually it was true. That was a truism.
I heard it in university in the late 90s, and I didn't buy it. I thought, no, there's a huge difference.
Yeah, but
the unions.
But actually, I think of it as, there's 15% of things, and that's what we see on the news.
Yes.
We see that constant back and forth over that 15%, and 85% they agree on. And it's all decided in back rooms, and we're not even consulted. And, two things that in the last election, so what's that, 3 months away, 4 months gone, immigration. Immigration is a massive issue in Australia. It's very controversial, and yet it wasn't raised as an election issue at all.
And the person who tried to raise it was called a racist.
Yeah. And secondly, congestion. Congestion is a massive problem, and it's just getting worse and worse and worse. Everyone, no matter where you are on the political spectrum, can see that it's getting worse, but it wasn't an issue. No one raised it as an issue.
Yes.
But this is the thing. Before the campaign started, there were stories about both of those issues in the papers and online, and then when the election was called, they stopped.
Maybe they didn't want to dog whistle, or be accused of dog whistling.
Well, I mean, the Labor Party is supposed to be the opposition.
Yes.
It's supposed to be opposing the government.
Yes.
But actually there is no opposition.
Because both sides basically have
that's
a
right.
stake in immigration.
Exactly. It's your turn, my turn, government.
Yes.
So that's our system of government.
Yes.
It's your turn, it's my turn.
So from your side versus my side to your turn, my turn. That's the reality of it.
Exactly.
Yeah. I think that's a good place to wrap it up. As I said, we scratched the surface, but it's been a good scratch. So thanks very much, Mark.
Thank you.
And thank you, listeners. We'll see you next week.
Thank you.